Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our workshop entitled Policy Development and Implementation. Please note, we are recording this session. So my name is Megan Jones and I'm the Program Manager for the Saskatchewan Association of Recreation Professionals. With me in the background is Guylaine Green, the Chief Administrative Officer for SARP, and our wonderful facilitator, Keith Comstock. You can see him, he does have his camera on. Before we introduce our speaker, we have some reminders for you. I just wanted to remind you that it is TR Awareness Month. This year, we wanted to take the opportunity to really thank our therapeutic recreation professionals across the province who play a crucial role in our healthcare system and make a really positive difference in our clients' lives and communities they serve. So join us on social media, take part in recognition of our TR professionals. So today's presentation has been set up as a webinar, but you do have access to the chat. So I will monitor the questions. Keith, whatever we'll let you decide and communicate to the group if you want questions throughout. I'm sure that this is a back and forth format. But Keith has many, many years of experience. I'm sure if you got his profile, that would be great if you could take a look at that. And Keith, I'm going to give you the floor. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to, I'm coming to you today from the JSGS Command Center in Southern Regina. Hope everybody is well and doing okay through this latest little cold snap that we're getting. This too shall pass, I promise you. I'm not sure when, but it will pass, I promise. So thanks for joining us. As Megan said, I'm going to attempt the death-defying screen share now as this goes. And essentially, what I just want to make sure everybody knows that this session is usually one that we do in a full day. And to that end, we do have a half-day version of this, and now this is a kind of a quarter of a day version of this. So we are going to be moving quickly. And I would, as Megan noted, encourage any questions that you might have. Feel free to jump in, unmute your microphones, or pop something into the chat if you like, and we'll be as interactive as we can with the amount of time we've got. One of the good things about this is it's a bit of a smaller group, so the activities ordinarily where I'd have us break off into separate meeting rooms and report back, and that we can just do it in a committee, the whole process, as opposed to anything else. So good morning to everyone. Let's get started. By the end of this workshop, my goals for you is to be able to better appreciate the modern complexities of policy. I know that many of you, just from knowing you over the years, there's probably two or three of you out there that could teach this thing just as well as I could, and you've got lots of experience, but there are some things that have changed over the course of the years. And I just want to talk about, what's it like in the 21st century as we head into the middle of the 2020s. I try to take a systems approach to almost everything that I do. I'm a very concrete sequential thinker. I'm a concrete sequential learner. I was one of those people that, the swimming instructor loved me because I loved it when she taught me how to use my arms first and then give me the leg kick and then teach me the breathing and then have me all put through all three of those together. So I'm a concrete sequential person, and we're going to talk this morning about the policy cycle and how you can use a bit of a systems approach to your approach to making good policy. Talk a little bit about and get some feedback from you folks too about policy design and some of the benefits or some of the techniques that you've used with success in your career, and hopefully share some good best practices as we go back and forth this morning by the time we're done. So that's our learning objectives from the school's perspective. Hopefully that lines up with yours. As I mentioned, this is to be considered as kind of an introductory course to the policy and development piece that we ordinarily do because of the time, but I hope that you'll find it of benefit. Here's the outline for the morning that we're spending together. I'm going to talk a little bit about an introduction to policy, and then I'll share with you the systems approach idea and this kind of a circular notion around the policy design process. And we'll talk about each one of these steps in as much detail as we have time for. Hopefully it'll give you an idea by the time we're done about how this can all be pulled together in the long run. So to get us started off, then I just want to have a brief discussion about what policy is, because sometimes, it can be a confusing topic, even though you think, well, policy is pretty straightforward. Thomas Dye, way back in 72, which is even before I started this business, said that public policy is anything that a government chooses to do or not do. And by extension, I think it's equally valid to say that anything an organization decides to do or not do can be classified as a policy. And then the implementation side, we teach policy development on its own, and then we teach a piece on implementation on its own. And now today we're going to talk about them as they're blended together. Really, implementation is just translating the goals and objectives of a policy into concrete action. And it sounds really easy when you say it quick like that, but obviously the devil is in the detail. Public policy determines the quality of the air we breathe, the quality of the water we drink. We are immersed, we are covered in policy decisions that others have made either on our behalf or that affect us every day, practically everything that we do, the air that we breathe, the water we drink, the streets we ride on, the participation in the activities that we choose, it's all around policies. Somebody at some time had to decide that this was a good idea and they were going to do it. So one of the interesting things, though, is that we find out that from the statistics and the people that do this on a regular basis tell us that almost a little bit more than almost 50% of new policy initiatives fail at some point in the process. And I just wanted to open up the mics, and if your bandwidth will handle it, for you to turn your cameras on so we can see you. I just wanted to open up the discussion for a minute and see if people have anything that ideas either from the pre-workshop materials or from from your experience about what are the main reasons that public policy goes wrong. Who wants to go first?
Keith, I can make a comment.
Go ahead.
Here you go.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Shelly, you or me? Okay, I would say some reasons why policy may fail is just the policy developers sometimes don't engage all the necessary parties that the policy will be affecting. And then once that policy may have passed, that policy or a different one, policies are set and then forgotten in organizations anyway, so they aren't properly maintained or properly managed as times change.
Yeah, two excellent points. Poor engagement is a hallmark of most. I often joke at the front of these sessions that, you know, the best learnings that I had was when things went wrong, and there have been plenty of times when our engagement processes were less than what they could have been, and we suffered as a result. This notion of setting a policy and then forgetting about it is another aspect of it that often I'm sure we've all said, you know, whether it's a strat plan or whether it's some other sort of thing, you kind of finish it and you dust your hands off, say, well, God, thank goodness that's over with. Now we can put that thing on the shelf and let the dust start to settle on it. We can get back to work. Let's see how that works. Shelley, what would you say?
Just a couple things, and I guess they're probably very parallel to each other that I've found is hidden agendas with people involved in the development, and whether it be organizational or personal, as well as political pandering from elected or non-elected people, which I guess can be hidden agendas as well. That can certainly lengthen the process and sometimes kill the process.
One of the really important aspects of policy development is understanding your enemy, and I mean that in a respectful way and in a positive way, but both from the perspective of making sure that the elected stay honest and most of them are honest. Let's face it. I mean, I'm not trying to say anything negative about them, but often decision makers do have a different way of looking at things and what the policy developers might. And so we can talk a little bit later this morning about how do you reconcile that? How do you prepare yourself for those sorts of conversations and to try and make sure that you've done everything you can as an administrator to make sure that things go the way you want them to. Anything else from anybody else?
I was going to say that sometimes there's not the opportunity to reassess, like, you know, try it out and then in a couple of months see, like you said, if it just got placed on the shelf or if people are actually using it. And I've found sometimes that what you think is going to happen isn't necessarily what happens. People find like a bit of a loophole. So I do think it's something that needs to be like a living thing, not just a one and done situation.
That's a really important point, Shannon, as well. That the notion of evaluating your policy at some point after it's been implemented, and then being able to, as my colleague Dan Flourson would say, aim small, shoot small. You know, make those little mid-course corrections as you're going, and be flexible is a really important point as well. So that's good. Anything in from anybody else? Well, the pre-workshop materials had a lot of different examples in there, and you know, these guys, the editors of this book, I've often looked at this book and I've resisted the temptation to try and say who it's by, because if you look at the bottom of that graphic on the right, have you ever seen 4 more difficult to pronounce names of people, of authors of a book? That it just does not roll off your tongue. But this Improving Public Policy for Good Governance is a pretty decent book, and they talk about a number of factors that what makes good policy, and we parroted that in the learning materials as well. Good policy is forward-looking, it's outward-looking, it's innovative, flexible, and creative. It's not all of those things that we talked about on the last slide. Where your implementation has suffered, where your planning was poor, you didn't define what success was going to look like at the front end. You didn't take advantage of learning about the culture of your organization and trying to figure out what impact that was going to have on your policy development process. And there's a whole bunch around communication. So when you look at it, all of the counterpoints to the points that folks have already brought out in that last slide are there in front of you. And I mean, this is a bit motherhood and apple pie, but I offer it to you because it does give a bit of a North Star, for lack of a better term, with respect to policy development. And I think you're trying to try and at least, if not a checkbox exercise, but be able to go back through at the end of the process and say, yeah, these are all factors that we considered as we were actively working on this particular piece of work that we had to do. I talked earlier about the policy cycle and about the systems approach to things, and why it's important. At least it's important for me to have a kind of a concrete sequential ABCD step-by-step process. And this graphic is as good as any of them that I've seen. You've probably seen lots of them in your travels as well, but this is the one that we use in the school. And that little rotating circle in the middle is intended to signify that this is it's a circular process, it's a continuous process, and it does often require you to bounce in between those different things. So on the one hand, I say, yes, this is a systems approach. Here's your step-by-step method for success. And then when you get into it, you often will find that, by the time we get to the policy approval stage, we need to go back and recheck our research, or we need to check our analysis again. So don't get hung up on the, oh my God, we're done policy approval. We can't go back and revisit that because now we're on to implementation. Think of this as a roadmap, but it's not, it's not one that you have to follow with strict adherence. You can bounce around in between those different sections. The other thing that I note for folks is that even though policy implementation is noted as a discrete step in this graphic, I've found over the course of the 40 plus years that I've been doing this, that implementation is a key consideration at every stage. So while we may identify policy implementation on this graphic as a discrete step at that 7, 8 o'clock position on the clock, really you're setting yourself up for failure if you don't talk about implementation or think about the issues that you're going to run into during every one of those other steps. So anybody have a model or experience with other ways of looking at policy development that might be a little bit different than this one?
I'll just add, Keith, sometimes the policy review can also be referred to as monitoring. And so when Shannon mentioned that last time, that was what I was going to say is, is it working and is it still relevant? I think one of the questions, in that policy review is it still relevant in our current context? Because if you look at some policies that were developed before COVID-19, they may not be relevant anymore.
Absolutely. Okay, I think Gold has a good quote there. There's no good way to implement bad policy, and poor policy design is a common reason for poor implementation. It's a bit of a domino effect, and he makes the other observation. Likewise, a well-designed policy can be poorly implemented, and that compromises your results too. So really, in a perfect world, you're looking for all of those things to come together and work in harmony in order for you to be successful. When we talk about policy in general terms, and this is really 101 level stuff, but I wanted to mention that at the front end. Really, there's only 2 kinds of policies that you commonly deal with on a day-to-day basis. One of them is the reactive policies, where you're where something has come up and you've decided, or your decision makers have decided things that need to be dealt with, or it can be a proactive approach. And of course, everybody always tries to stay in that proactive approach, but quite often we find ourselves in the middle of being in a reactive situation. And I know everybody has used the pandemic for every good and bad example for everything in the last 3 years, but it really is a fantastic example of a whole bunch of systems being pressured in all kinds of weird ways, and that nobody really was prepared for it, or was had planned for it, despite the fact that pandemic planning is a pretty important part of the business that you're in when you're in government. So reactive, proactive, either way, I think that's it's just an important point to make, that you're in it, and it affects your mindset a little bit, and it does have some implications on how you might present the problem to the policymakers. But as long as you're aware of these kind of two general categories, you're going to be fine. The first step in that wheel then that we talked about is problem recognition and identification. And one of the things that what I try to do in these sessions is give you as many helpful hints or as many kind of practical ideas as possible. And one of the things that I found that was really plagued me early on in my career was I really found it difficult to look at problems from all of their sides. So when, anybody who knows me well will know that I'm pretty much, like 99% of the time, I am positive I have the right answer. Now, my track record, my wife and others would tell you, is more about 60%, but my mind says 90%. And part of the problem is because I have very great difficulty looking at problems from different perspectives. So everybody's seen this graphic before. You either see the margarita glass, depending on the time of day. If it's getting close to happy hour, you see the margarita glass. If it's early in the morning, you see the two silhouettes looking at each other. And there's all those kinds of little tricks, eye tricks that you can find on the net to illustrate this. I use another metaphor, is where I try to actually consciously force myself into looking at the problem as something that's sitting on the table in front of me. And then I metaphorically and intellectually move myself around the table, and I look at the problem from this side of the table, and then I move to the end of the table and I look at it from the other end. And as you get used to that, it becomes part of your thought process. And instead of having to make a conscious effort at looking all of the different aspects of a problem, you're kind of metaphysically doing it to yourself, and using your processes to make sure you look at it. I mention that at this point because problem recognition and identification is one of the most fundamental areas where people often rush through it. Because we all think we know what the problem is, we all think we know what the answer is, but it's I will preach to the day I'm done doing this business that the more time you spend on the problem identification and recognition phase, the better off you will be in the long run. So at the outset, really what you're trying to do is, and these again are not intended to be exhaustive, but they're the kinds of things that I would encourage you to think about when you're trying to identify what the root problem is. What is the real problem? Is the real problem that, the item that has been brought to your attention by decision makers, or is that a symptom of a darker or a deeper or more complicated problem that might need attention as well? It's the old idea of when you go to the doctor, he asks you where it hurts. And quite often where it hurts doesn't have very much to do with what the problem is. And it's the same idea on the policy development side. You're looking at alignment with organizational priorities. We're looking at the target population. I've got a bunch of questions on the next slide that you can print out and ask yourself when you're in this problem identification mode. And one of the questions that I always asked my staff was, it was kind of a story a little bit, because in my business, in my former business, government can pretty much do anything it wants. And if you're in the municipal area or in an organization, you can pretty much do whatever you want within the boundaries of your legislation and that sort of thing, of course. But you pretty much have carte blanche. However, in the government, it was a little more complicated because, quite frankly, we could do pretty much anything we wanted to if we had enough energy and time and resources. There are a few things the provinces can't get involved in: national defense, immigration, that sort of thing. Even though we do have some impact on the implementation side of immigration, but like I said, on the government side, you can do pretty much anything we want. So the question I would ask my staff is, yes, we could do that, but are we the only ones that could do that? And so that was another part of the questioning that I had that we always went through was, yeah, sure, we could if we wanted to, but are we the best ones to do it? Are we positioned properly? Are we, are we right in terms of the political climate and of the other timing issues around making us do this thing? So when you're talking about identifying problem, here's a list of things that you can just print off and put in your policy development manual or whatever you've got. That, and again, I don't intend these to be exhaustive. These are representative of the questions that you'll want to ask yourself about just in as part of defining that problem. One at the bottom is are there any veto players? And that whole question around who are the players, it speaks to Shelley's comments earlier on about the impact that the elected and their wants and desires can have on the process. And it also makes you look outside your organization, because quite often, at least in the business of municipalities, there will be veto players either at the province or the federal side where you can't do what you want to do despite having all of that famous municipal autonomy that we talk about. Some examples of poor problem definition, we need a 4-lane highway as opposed to we need improved highway safety or efficient transportation links. Great debate going on in social media now about cities and larger urban communities and transportation, and about how making more lanes and adding bicycle lanes is not the way to do this. It's a fundamental shift in our thinking that's required. We need a hospital is the problem, as opposed to what we want is a healthier population, because hospitals are a very well, even though they're multidimensional in focus, they are one-dimensional in terms of it being a bricks and mortar facility, and there's more than one way of skinning the cat, as you all know. There's too much crime, as opposed to we need an increased sense of safety in our community, and we can't grow corn in Saskatchewan even though we do, as opposed to we'd like to see greater financial strength in agriculture. So when you're talking to your elected about this, the problem identification and recognition phase is really important, because that's the foundation, that's the fundamental thinking behind all of the rest of your work around the policy development rests on this stage. So pay it some good attention. Does that make sense to folks? Oh, I wanted to go back, but now I don't know how. There, I did it. What other questions would you ask if you were looking to define a problem in a proactive way?
Do you want me to add something, Keith?
Sure.
What are other municipalities doing or other communities doing, and are they comparable to ours?
Yep. That's a legitimate question to ask at this point. It would be also something that would be part of your analysis and your research phase, but absolutely nothing wrong with saying, I mean, looking up from your book at the horizon and seeing who else is wrestling with this is never a bad idea. Anything else that folks would add?
I'm just going to say, ask them their lessons learned.
Yep. Okay, so let's move on to the policy research phase. And once you've satisfied yourself that you've actually identified the problem and you've broken it down into its component parts, and you've really got a good handle on, okay, just what is it that we're trying to accomplish here, then you can start doing some research about the problem. And again, this is another list that you can use, that you can feel free to print off. And we talk about staying in curiosity. So you haven't started to talk about solutions yet, right? You're in the problem identification phase. And now we're going to talk about doing some research so we can better understand this problem. And here's some questions that you can ask yourself, or that you can answer. And again, it's not intended to be exhaustive, but these are representative of things that you would want to ask yourselves about the nature of the problem, what its root cause is, how others are perceiving the problem, the politics behind it. It's really this stage of developing a good understanding of the problem that you're dealing with. And you're asking questions and not worrying too much about you're always worried about answers, but identifying the questions is more important than anything at this part. Policy research can either be primary research, where you do the research yourself. Not very many of us have the luxury or the capacity to be able to do that. So quite often you're using secondary research, using existing studies or information or best practices from others that you're going to, steal. Bill Ware used to tell us all the time, the definition of creativity is learning how to hide your sources. I believe in that firmly. not the least of which is this AI problem that we're all dealing with now, so don't plagiarize, but don't be scared to borrow either. And this really does also include a best choice of comparison process where you can look around and say, okay, well, in this particular place with this climate and this set of characteristics, they chose to attack this problem in this way. Does that make sense from our perspective? And again, it relates back to Megan's comment about looking at what others have done. When you're talking about, when you're doing this research and you're thinking about what you want to do and how, so is a question also, how do we actually know this is a problem? Evidence and data. Yeah, that's a really good point, because we're at this point, it's back to that conversation I used to have with my staff. Is this our problem? I mean, it is a problem. It's probably going to be a problem, but is it our problem? And if it's our problem, are we, where are we in the cycle of being able to create an effective solution to it? So there's absolutely nothing wrong with asking all of those kinds of existential questions at the front end of your process, because those are going to be the ones that will trip you up the most often when you talk to the elected or when you talk to decision makers. I can't remember how many times, well, early in my career, it didn't happen that much towards the end because I smartened up, but at the front end, I used to get all kinds of problems with talking to the elected and saying, here we go, this is the problem, minister. And then the minister would come back and say, you know what, I'm not sure that is the problem. Okay, what about this? What about that? Have you thought about this? And oftentimes I didn't have a good answer for him. And those kinds of being able to be quick off the mark and have a good answer ready is all part of good preparation in this research phase. But when you're in the research phase, you can start thinking about how you might approach the suite of options that you're going to recommend to your decision makers about how this policy should roll out. And so when we talk about policy tools, we divide them into four general areas: information and moral suasion, regulation and control, using economic instruments to affect your change, or direct service delivery. And I'm just going to talk very briefly about each one of these and get some feedback from you folks. Who can give me some examples of policy development where information and moral suasion was used as the guiding light, as the guiding principle for what the problem was going to be? This is particularly prevalent in our industry, in the recreation industry. So I'm sure that you'll have at least 30 examples in the next 10 seconds.
Well, I know in the programs that I lead, we talk a lot about the value for mental and physical health. So it's kind of like, hey, if you want your kids to have good mental and physical health, you should come to our program.
Moral suasion, absolutely.
Yeah.
Another example? It doesn't have to be a rec one. Seatbelts. Even though that was a combination of legislation and regulation, but there was a ton of moral suasion around seatbelt use, drinking and driving, bicycle helmets, don't slow down in the snow zone. The average 60-year-old Swede is in better shape than the average 30-year-old Canadian. Walk a block a day. All of those influence without necessarily having a legal or a financial imperative on this. And again, lots of these are hybrid. As Shannon said, their projects are, they're certainly moral suasion oriented, but there are other outcomes there as well. And even with the things like the seat belts and the no smoking and the work zone and all of those kinds of things, there is often another component that goes with this. It is a bit of a carrot and stick situation, but information and moral suasion is a tried and true policy implementation and development option that you can keep an eye on. Economic instruments. Anybody have any thoughts on what sort of things we're talking about when we're talking about economic instruments as policy?
Well, I worked for the provincial government when they got rid of the film employment tax credit. I was unfortunately in that part of government. So yeah, they completely eliminated I guess they were calling it a subsidy, which more or less destroyed the industry in the province. So I guess those types of financial instruments can affect things.
Absolutely. The film employment tax credit was the first piece of legislation that I wrote in my career, Shannon. So
did you work with Don Martin on that one?
I did.
Oh, no way. I worked with Don like
yeah.
20 years ago when I was in government. Yeah, nice.
and it was Dawn and I have known with here as we all do the Saskatchewan 1 degree of separation.
Yeah.
Dawn Martin and her husband Dave used to live in Makwa, and she was a part of the arts community up there on the Arts Council, and so that's when I first got to know her. But then as she worked through the city of Saskatoon and our other appointments with the provincial government, we worked closely together. So tax credits and deferrals for sure, grants and contributions. Everybody. But the first thing that pops to mind is we're going to do. We need a new playground. We need a new facility. We need a program. Who out there cares about the results of this like we do, and do they have any money? Things like tax deferrals for the development of new community resources. Everybody, you build a house in this particular subdivision, and we'll give you a 5-year tax break on your property taxes. All of those sorts of things come underneath the rubric of economic instruments, and again, they can be as wide and as varied and as lucrative or not as you want them to be, and often again used in combination with some of these others. The third one we talk about is regulation, and everybody can very quickly come up with, governments and municipalities and even organizations love to regulate. In fact, hardly a day goes by when we don't have somebody else think of something, smart that we should do, whether it's, I don't know, my kid, all of the stuff that we did when we were kids, rode without bike helmets and chewed the lead paint off our cribs, and all the stuff that now governments have taken over fall underneath the category of regulation and control. The other thing that somebody mentioned earlier on, maybe it was you, Shannon, that talked about the downside of some of these policy choices, and that quite often you have unintended consequences, and the regulation and control world is full of those. I used to tease the municipal administrators when I spoke with them regularly, is that one of my key policy development processes was trying to figure out whom among the people that I was trying to regulate was going to be smart enough to beat my effort. And so it was there was a little bit of it was a good-natured competition there. I often said that municipal administrators can figure out more ways around government regulation than anybody else in the world. The building code, workers' compensation, all of those things come underneath regulation and control. And I know you've got the same sort of things at the organizational level or the municipal level that are the same. And the last one is the direct services, and I saved the direct services to the end because that was usually the way that we looked at it, was when all else failed, we looked at providing the service ourselves. And there was obviously a whole list of questions, some of them that are on the screen in front of you, that the system needed to ask itself about this before we actually made a direct service provision decision, because of all of the different implications and aspects that needed to be considered. So I would invite you to use those keep those 4 things in the back of your mind as you're doing your policy research, and start to make those connections in your own mind without writing anything down in pen yet, about how you might approach what policy instrument you might use. Again, this will be a recurring theme throughout the morning. This is part of your foundational preparation for not only preparing the policy and recommending it, but also answering to the decision makers, because they're going to come back to you and say, well, did you think about this? And did you think about that? And what about going at it from this perspective? And what about going at it from that perspective? And your stakeholders, when you're doing your engagement phase, will ask you all of these questions as well. So again, this is time well spent at the front end. I'm going to keep on going fairly quickly. I'm going to invite you, if you've got something that you want to contribute, to either pop it into the chat or jump into the, unmute your microphone and jump in. But I'm going to keep on forging ahead because I'm conscious of the time here. The third step is policy analysis and design. And so at this point now, if you're following along in that little clock-shaped process, we've identified the problem, we've recognized it, we've diagnosed it, we've poked it, we've prodded it, we've done everything we can to really understand what kind of an animal it is. And then we've done some research. We've done some background thinking about what are the different aspects, the political realities, the functional realities around implementation and elsewhere, and done the beginnings of some thinking around what sort of policy instruments are we going to bring to bear on this issue. Now, this is the Cadillac of processes, right? I mean, I'm not saying you need to spend 5 days in the policy identification phase. You might do that in an hour. Okay. Same thing with the research. If it's a huge problem, like, how do we solve world hunger, it's obviously going to take a little more research than, what are the implications of coming up with a new meeting format template for reports to the board or to council. So depending on the policy that you're implementing, these stages either are longer or shorter and more complicated or less complicated, but it's important that you go through them for the reasons that I've indicated in terms of being able to justify at the end of the day what you've been doing. So when you move into the policy analysis and design phase, then here are just some of the kinds of things that you look at. This also relates back to my earlier comments about looking at that problem from different positions around the table. So if you force yourself to look at the problem and to look at your analysis in these categories, and again any others that you have that might be appropriate for your organization, you're going to be well positioned to both make good decisions on the actual tool you decide using, and answering the questions that you are going to get from your stakeholders and your decision makers around this. So really what you're talking about, stakeholder client analysis, these are not complicated. You're going to go out and talk to the folks that are going to be impacted or affected by the policy, the ones that are going to be have use of it, primary and secondary, and maybe even tertiary, depending on how complicated the problem is. And you're going to talk to them about how they feel about not only the problem, but what the solution might need to look at. Legal analysis is one that quite often smaller organizations don't need to worry about too much, but it's absolutely an impact. And by legal, I mean, do you need bylaw changes? Do you need either to the municipality or to the organization that you're working with? Is there a regulation that needs to be done? And what are the implications of making those changes? Because anytime you're talking about making a change to a law or to a bylaw, it automatically adds all kinds of complicating factors and timelines to your process. Feasibility analysis, everybody's familiar with, do a feasibility study. If you build it, they will come. What's his name? Dances with Wolves guy didn't do that in Field of Dreams. He just built it and counted on them to come. But ordinarily, you don't have the luxury of being able to do that. You're going to talk about whether or not it's feasible. An impact analysis, sometimes that's a piece of work that you can do around trying to anticipate not only the good things that we've been talking about, but as Shannon said, the unintended implications of what might happen, and then a cost benefit analysis. One of the things that we always get tricked into, and Shannon, you'll remember this from the days around the film employment tax credit, is this push-pull we have in our industry around justifying ourselves on the public good side of things, where recreation services and soft things on the social side are good just because they are. And it's not because of the economic impact of them that we want to support them. On the other hand, there is an economic aspect to the work that we do and to the activities that we run at the community level or at the organization level. And it's something that you need to make some value decisions around about what way you want to look at this. And I believe that one of the reasons why the film industry ultimately failed was and why the government of the day at that time chose not to, was because they found people that could give them better ROI on the money than the film industry could. And also there were some things around what the film industry did in terms of its care and feeding of the political system that weren't very effective. But that's a seminar for another day. Any other kinds of analysis that you folks regularly do as a part of your policy development process that maybe aren't captured here?
I was just thinking, I don't know if this is cost benefit analysis, but I find with recreation and environmental education programs, not just making that argument for the public good, but actually having measurables like this. You can in terms of environmental education, like this reduce the carbon footprint by this much. I feel like when you're applying for grants or you're trying to do things like having those really concrete measures, I'm not finding people buying the argument like kids should get outside because it's good for them. It doesn't seem to bring the money in.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Or you get lip service, right? Everybody's, oh
yeah.
Yes.
But then no one wants to support it. So I don't know if it's an evaluation framework. Maybe that's something different for program design, but yeah.
It's all aspects of it. And it's not too early at this stage to start thinking about what those outcomes are. You don't want to at this point pin yourself down too definitively to those, because they will change and evolve as you go through the process. But I absolutely agree with you that it's valuable to think about in terms of, okay, well, what do we really think needs to happen here? And at the end of the day, You're going to have a long list at the beginning of the potential outcomes, and then you're going to wean yourself down to the 3 or 4 key ones at the end of the process that you're going to use to try and define what the policy is. But all of those sorts of discussions are good at the front end. Here's another list for you that you can use because you're going to come across evidence. You're going to, as you're doing your analysis and your research, people are going to say, okay, do it this way and do it that way. And here's what we tried. And sometimes Google is both your best friend and your enemy these days, because, in the olden days, who's here that's kind of my contemporary? Shelley, in the olden days when we had to do a report for school, what did you have? You had the encyclopedia at home. If your parents had a subscription to National Geographic, that was usually a good place to go. Every once in a while, you could cheat and skip volleyball practice and go to the library if you had to do some research. But really, those were the 3 things those were your go-to sources of research, back in the olden days. Now you Google a term, governance sustainability, and you'll get like 2,786,000 hits from every web page in the world, and all of these guys that have paid good money to become higher up on a search engine result. And it's it's really difficult sometimes to figure out who to believe. So here's some questions. We have a whole, if we do the whole day long, we do a much expanded version of this where we talk about, this list of things kind of sums up the questions that you can ask to try and evaluate the research and the evidence that you come across. And it's particularly important because everybody else has access to all that stuff too. So if you're thinking about taking a particular approach to a problem, being able to justify it and being able to have some critical evaluation of what others are saying around the policy suggestion that you're making is important.
Heath?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I really like this set of questions for the simple reason that when solutions or potential policy information is set on a council table, and I'm coming from an elected perspective with this comment, everybody has Googled it. And you all of a sudden have 7 experts around your table. And, it's wonderful to be informed, but everyone also brings 7 different versions and interpretations. So I really like this idea of a standard set of questions so that you can collectively critique the evidence that we have. So I really like this aspect. That's just
good.
a comment.
No, I appreciate that. And I agree with you. There was a set of, I used to talk to my folks, and there's a set of questions that I asked myself when I was at the policy analysis level. When I was a policy analyst and I was doing that work, there was kind of this list of 6 or 7 or 8 things that I would ask myself every time I had a problem. I'd say, okay, did I think about that? Did I think about this? Then when I got to be an executive director, there was all of those questions. And then there were some additional ones. Then when I got to be an assistant deputy minister, there was another set of questions, and the questions got increasingly more vague as you go up up the food chain in an organization. But what it does, that sort of rigor forces you to think about the questions that people are going to ask you. And also, it's a check and balance in your own thinking, because, I know there's type A personalities out there like me that, ordinarily my first thought is the right answer as far as I'm concerned. And quite often that's not the way the real world works. So these questions and having rigor attached to it is often helpful. When we talk about policy design, then when again, following our way around that circle graphic, when you've satisfied yourself that you've looked at the evidence and you've thought about what sort of policy instrument you might want to use, you've defined the problem, you've done all those good steps. Now you can start to actually do what everybody usually does first, which is design the policy that you're going to try and implement. And without belaboring the point too much, if you don't have a clear understanding of the problems and the desired outcomes that you want to see, and if you haven't, I talked about some policy options that you might want to think about during the design phase, then you're going to be in worse shape at the end. And at the end, all of this is intended to be able to say, the best option to achieve our goals is going to be the result of this. Quite often, the best option is not, sometimes there's a confusion between the best option and the most appropriate option as well. So the best option for me a couple of months ago, when the differential in Janet's Envoy went, was to buy a new Land Rover. That would have been my best option. My most appropriate option was to buy a 2018 Hyundai used, with a couple of dents in it, because that was more in keeping with the outcomes that I wanted. One of the outcomes being not to have to live in a tent and spend it all on a vehicle. So just give some thought to that when you're getting into the design. We'll talk about it in more detail now. One of the ways that you can do this in terms of policy design is use something we call the logic model. It looks way more complicated than it is. Okay, so don't worry about that too much. If you just take a moment and walk through this graphic, it becomes very clear. One of the best ways of coming up with an effective policy is to think about is to use a logic model, but work instead of from left to right like we always are used to in Western societies. You work right to left. So think about, instead of thinking about the resources or inputs that you have at the front end, think about what impact you want to have. Shannon talked about outcomes. What are the results? What's the change that you want to see? How will things be better? How will things be happier? What will be the drop in childhood obesity? What will be and again, some of these things are really difficult. And I acknowledge that designing outcomes that you actually have control over and that you're actually willing to put your, sign your name under and say, I'm going to be accountable for that outcome is much different than talking about it in theory during a session like this. But you absolutely need to think about that, because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, or if you're not getting the results you want, you've wasted your time and your energy. So by thinking about impact and outcomes at the front end, and then working your way backwards to say, okay, well, if I was really actually going to buy a Land Rover, what would I need to do? Well, sell a kid, first of all. Second of all, quit my, no more wine. That's it. We're done, Janet. No more wine. So if you want a Land Rover, we're not gonna have water in the pool this year. That's it. Sorry, we've got no water in the pool. That's gonna be and then what outputs would you need? A better loan, better credit rating, that sort of thing. So by thinking about resources, activities, and outputs on the action-oriented side as a way of achieving the outcomes and the impacts, but it is a counterintuitive way for us to think. Our brains are wired so that we think action first, as opposed to the outcomes. And I'm encouraging you to work backwards. And again, this the rest of that logic model is about your planned work and your intended response and your intended results. And the external influences can have an effect at all those areas. And again, rather than being worried about it, you just anticipate it and you figure out how you're going to deal with those external influences, whether it be a budget perspective or a timing perspective or a delivery problem. And again, all the way through this, you're thinking about, okay, if we go this way, what are we going to do to implement it? Who needs to know? Who's actually going to be the one that's going to do the work? When we get to the implementation, I'll tell you one of my most famous failures, and it will help to illustrate why implementation is really important to think about as you go. Anybody ever seen or used this logic model before or something like it? Okay. It's a relatively well-known one, and I like it because, for me, my tiny little brain doesn't like complicated things, so it's simple enough to work. So this, I've just included in your deck a bit of a description of each one of those elements in case you ever have to explain it to somebody else why you're using this and how to think about the different categories and topics that you'll want to consider as you're going through the logic model. One of the things, well, eventually you're going to have to come up with some options, all right? And at the risk of, thank you, Captain Obvious, they ought to be viable. There's nothing that drives a decision maker or a minister or a deputy crazier than options being brought forward that are clearly off the table. We used to, back in the bad old days, whenever government came to us and said, okay, well, we've got a budget cut, we want 5% off your base from last year, or whatever the percentage was. Back in the day, a long time ago, more than 20 years ago now, what we would do is say, okay, well, revenue sharing, we'd put up that holy grail of revenue sharing for the municipalities and say, we're already like $200,000 short to run this ministry. If you want more money from us, it's going to come out of the program side. We knew that government was not likely to take that option. And as prudent civil servants, it wasn't fair for us to bring up that thing that we knew was obviously off the table. We did it. But over the course of time, we got smarter, and the system got smarter too. And they would say, they would give us more direction. Some of the other aspects of viability that you might want to think about is, is there a chance to push the envelope here? The conversation around 5-year driver's licenses, or 5 and 10-year passports, I'm sure was an interesting one, where they thought about, here's a solution to this policy problem, however they defined it, and we're going to push the envelope by doing something different. Other things that you need to worry about in terms of key considerations, the electoral cycle. Where are you at in terms of the tenure of your board, or the tenure of your council, the tenure of your provincial government, and is the timing right for whatever option that you want to bring forward? Where are you at in the budget cycle? Can you do the work that you're going to do within your existing resources? Do you need new? Are you going to stop doing something else before you can do something new? All of those things, as well as the legislative cycle. It's a little bit different at the municipal side of things, because you can pretty much implement a bylaw or introduce a bylaw whenever you want. But there is a season to these sorts of things, and absolutely on the provincial side, the legislative cycle, if you're looking at making large changes, the legislative and regulation cycle can have a huge impact on the options that you want to bring forward. Is there an element of innovation? It's a bit of a catchphrase for everybody these days. You wake up on a Tuesday and you say, well, good, let's be innovative today. I understand it's not like that. Innovation is part of the DNA, or the part of the culture of your organization, but it is one of the key considerations from a viability perspective that you always want. Is there a way for us to do something new and different that maybe nobody else has seen in our part of the world yet, that is still going to have a good option or a good chance of being successful? And then what's our risk management process? We'll talk about risk in a little bit about how you consider those things. But all of those aspects go underneath this notion of coming up with some options that are viable. And everybody will often say, okay, well, how many options should we have? How many do we need? And what order should we put them in? So, I mean, there's no one right answer to this, but from my perspective, from the 40 plus years that I've been doing this, that option, I always put the option that I was recommending first. My preferred option was always the one that I was recommending. My theory was, quite often, folks that are interested, even if they're really interested in the topic area, are not going to read any farther. If they agree with the recommendation, they don't even read the rest. Right. So I'm not going to make them read through all the things that I don't recommend before they get to the thing that I do recommend. So that was my strategy there. And I always included the status quo. Even though everybody loves to say, the status quo is not an option. Quite frankly, more often than not, the status quo is a perfectly legitimate option. And many times governments will choose to do it because of, a myriad of reasons. We can't get agreement amongst our stakeholders. So we're going to keep on, we're going to keep the devil we know, because the devil we don't know is scarier. And so, all of the options that we want to do for change are too expensive. So don't discount this notion of including your status quo. And you don't have to count it as a real one if you don't want to, so you can feel free to have 4. I'm not sure I agree totally with this slide about, option 2, what people think will work and what experts think will work with one delivery method, but you can decide for yourselves, what sort of category do you want to. I often use the Cadillac, Chevrolet, Volkswagen analogy as well, and categorize my options according to cost or to how difficult they would be to implement. That's part of your thinking process. So you're going to come up with some policy options based on, those 4 instruments that we talked about earlier, some combination of them. It's going to be well based on your research and your analysis that you've done. It's going to have some direct line of sight correlation between the outcomes that you want to achieve. And you've thought about the inputs and the outcomes and you've thought about inputs, outputs, and resources that are needed. And at the end of the day, you'll have a good suite of things to talk about. Here's just a very basic graph that just gives you an illustration of some decision criteria that you might be able to use or design for yourselves to compare your options. Okay, so everybody's going to say, well, why are you recommending this as opposed to that? And here's where you trot out your graph and say, okay, well, we're choosing option 2 because the time to implement is 3 years and we can live with that. The time to effectiveness is 5, all of those, so that the items that run down the left hand side of that graph are going to be particular to the problem or the issue that you're trying to deal with. But it does provide a really easy way of making sure that you've covered all the bases that you want to do. And this can be, it can either be 4 or 5 or 6 items long, or it can be 106 items long, depending on the process or depending on the issue that you're dealing with. But again, my recommendation to you is that you document your analysis. And again, so, additional questions: what's the public response liable to be? What will stakeholders say? What will the media say? Are we creating any precedents that we don't want to, or are we creating a precedent that we do want to encourage? And then what risks exist? So talking about risk, again, I'm forging on here. So if you've got something, I don't see anything popping up in the chat, and I haven't heard anybody unmute their microphone. So I'm going to forge on here. When you talk about risk, it's been mentioned on a number of slides here, and we teach a whole day-long seminar on risk management. But in theory, here's the kinds of things that you want to think about. When you talk about risk, everything has risk. All right, there isn't a program alive or a policy that's been put into place that didn't have some element of risk, greater or less. But when you're trying to categorize them, here are just some very basic categories that you will want to think about and maybe consider. Is there a financial risk? What happens if the budget, if we haven't budgeted enough money? What happens if things go wrong and our reputation is worried? And these are sometimes things that organizations don't think about very well. Either the reputational risk or the unintended risks that come out, because we all have this this bias built into ourselves. We're usually overly optimistic about the results we're going to get, and sometimes effectiveness and unintended consequences can get ignored. Just a very brief bit of a discussion on these different factors. When you're talking about effectiveness, here's some questions that you can ask yourself that will help you to both evaluate the options and to think about maybe some new ways of looking at effectiveness. Is the plan suitable? One of the things that, and this talks to geographic areas, but it also is suitable from the climate perspective or from the financial perspective. All of those different aspects can come into this. Will it create a problem somewhere else? That's one that we often don't think of. I can't tell you how many times we did something at government relations and then environment would come back to us and say, yeah, you didn't really help us with that. Thanks, but we wish you wouldn't have done that. So there's, our problem there was engagement and not doing very good analysis, but it happens. In terms of evaluating options, again, from the response, what will the response be from the public, from program users, from program suppliers, stakeholders, and media, and from each. So you're, again, without reiterating it too strongly, you're taking all of the options all of the policy options that you're considering, and you're running them through this evaluation process to compare them and contrast them, and to try and figure out which ones are going to be the most effective, most efficient, have the least amount of resources required, and have a timeline generally that you're going to be able to live with. You may well have other questions or attributes that the option must satisfy. And as you have done your problem identification and recognition, your research and your analysis and design phases, you should be taking note of these things, right? In order to be successful, we're going to have to address this. In order to be successful, we're going to have to make sure we pay attention to that, or whatever else the list of things are. And this also, again, repeating it again, is an implementation issue. The how long will it take to implement, and who do we have to have on board are very real and relevant questions to ask yourself at this phase. Somebody mentioned, again, I think with Shannon maybe talked about engagement. Shell did too. I used to think back in the day that, really engagement was just about sussing out where I was going to get, where are the EORs, Where are the people that are going to complain about this? Who are the people that I have to prove wrong in order to get my way? And that's the absolute wrong way to think about this. Engagement is all about getting more ideas on the table, helping yourself to view the problem from different perspectives by asking others to give you input. One of the things that I learned probably too late in my career was that the best people that I ever hired were the ones that didn't think I was that smart. There were a lot of those people, and also the ones that weren't scared to disagree with me. I found that those were really the most valuable people to achieving success, were the people that could question what I was taking at face value. Good engagement also increases your buy-in and support from the people that you're going to impact or that you're going to have to convince. It's also a fairness aspect to it. In other sessions, we talk about something called the satisfaction triangle, where there's three things that are necessary for someone to be satisfied with what it is that you're doing. One of them is a process-oriented thing. They have to feel like they've been heard. They have to feel like they had an opportunity to bring their thoughts and dreams and hopes and wishes forward. There's also the substantive things. What are we actually going to do? That's obviously a big part of satisfaction in any decision. And the other thing is this, like they've been felt, they've been listened to, they've been heard, they've been, from a psychological perspective, they've felt engaged in the process. It's also a good no surprises policy. I'm sure all of you that have supervisory responsibilities have said at one time to your staff, it doesn't matter to me. I know we all make mistakes. What I want is no surprises. If something goes wrong, tell me. If you think something's going to happen, I would far rather know about it earlier rather than later. It just improves your credibility and increases your chance of success. So really at its simplest, engagement and consultation is about talking to people, particularly those who are to be affected by it, or those who are going to have to be accountable for it at the end of it. Shelley notes in the chat, engagement is a very grounding activity. It often brings to the table the fact that you really may not be going the direction that the public wishes, and that's absolutely true. There's history is rife with, there's that famous Henry Ford saying, right? If Henry Ford had listened to his customers, what he would have done was breed faster horses. He wouldn't have worried about motor cars. So there's that aspect of it. Sometimes the public doesn't know what they need either. So I'm not discounting that, but quite often more often than not, you'll see the other problem, whereas the system of the bureaucrats don't have a full understanding of what the public really wants or what they really believe they need. And it's important to do that. So engagement is important, and it's all part of this phase where you're socializing the options that you're putting on the table, and that you're getting people to react to them, so that you can have as much as possible the support of those you're going to be affecting at the end of the day. Policy approval. Okay, at some point in time, if you've done all your work correctly, you're going to have to determine what your recommendation is, and this really is. Sometimes people agonize over this, like, oh my God, what am I going to decide? Well, if you've hit the steps that we've talked about so far this morning, the recommendation that you're going to make should be pretty much self-evident by that point, right? You've done your homework, you've done good policy design, you've done good research, you've done good engagement, you've studied the problem from all its many facets and from every angle that you can think of. And with all of that ammunition at the ready and all of that thinking having been done, it's pretty easy to determine your recommendation. But in terms of how you phrase it, just some advice for you. Please try to state your recommendation option clearly so as to distinguish it from other options. Two things: make sure it stands out from the other options, and two, phrase it so your decision makers can give you a yes or a no answer. That was one of the most frustrating things. In fact, I talked to a set of an administrator the other day, and this was an experienced administrator. This wasn't somebody new to the system. They were describing a situation that was involved in their community and that they were really having trouble with, and they were going to take this problem to council. And I said, so what are you going to recommend? And this person said, well, I'm going to recommend that council makes the decision about this. And I said, really? That's your recommendation? And I know this guy pretty good, so I was able to talk quite bluntly. I said, I'm sorry, but you're not fulfilling your responsibilities as a civil servant by passing the buck like that. You have to determine what your recommendation is based on your research and analysis. And if you're not doing that, you're not fulfilling the expectations that people have of you. A little bit about strategic communications. You know, there isn't, this area doesn't have its own box on the flow chart, but strategic communications are really important. Well, communications in general, and then if you're going to bother to communicate, you might as well be strategic about it. It's a really important part of it. Coming up with key messages. I had a group on the line yesterday and I said, do you want my elevator speech on this issue? Do you want my coffee break speech on this issue? Or do you want my let's go to lunch speech on this issue? And so you're prepared in a variety of ways to get your message out and to different audiences and in different ways. And again, all of this is embedded about how you're going to know your plan is effective at the end, because really you want people to, not in an inappropriate way, but you're trying to win the day, right? You're trying to drive your policy recommendation forward. So strategic communications is important. Also, most people don't pay enough attention to actually making the announcement once the decision is made. And again, all of this thinking needs to happen before you go to the decision makers and say, okay, decide on this. You want to think about what's your announcement plan? Who's going to announce it? Where and when will it happen? Who's in the audience? All of those sorts of, they seem like picky little details when you talk about them on a day like today, but trust me, you can really get yourself, one of the problems is that as we are solving these policy issues on the ground, we become so immersed in them and so well versed and knowing everything there is about them, we forget that not everybody has the depth of knowledge that we do, and as a result, you're getting people to speak on your behalf, but they don't have your knowledge. So having a good announcement plan and being prepared to help folks get through that process, because ordinarily it's not going to be you that's announcing the policy; it's going to be one of your elected or one of your decision makers or the board that makes it. Again, speeding our way. The implementation. So I've already said implementation and how you're going to actually do this needs to be a subtext or a part of the conversation at each stage in the policy development process. But there is a time when you actually have to, when you actually have to sit down and, okay, well, we're going to really get down in the weeds now and we're going to design the implementation process for this. Just open the mics again and say, what anybody ever had an implementation go wrong, go horribly wrong before I bare my soul and tell you all mine?
Keith, this is probably one of the areas where I find most policies actually goes terribly south, is implementation, because a lot of times you have a lot of staff, I'm speaking from a municipal perspective, that may have been long serving and that's nice, we have a policy now. And they basically go about business and just getting it done. And sustainability is a huge issue with being able to follow up that we actually are monitoring the policy, and we're so busy getting it done. And that's just a big problem with policy development at all levels, is reaction as opposed to proaction. And I think that's a lot of my experience with implementation is it can be a long time before the actual policy gets followed, because there's lack of follow-up and a sustainability plan for it, or a plan for follow-up. So that's my experience.
Absolutely. Anybody else with an observation or a story about implementation? While you're thinking, I'll share mine. So a number of years ago, you remember Walkerton in Ontario had a very disastrous cryptosporidium outbreak in their potable water system, and it actually caused some loss of life. And then a little while after that, we had kind of a mini Walkerton in North Battleford, and quite a few people got sick, and nobody died, thank goodness. But it was one of those things where, holy crap, our worst fears are being realized here. And so in response to that, the government said, okay, well, we don't want this to happen again, right? So what policy implement, what instruments are we going, what are we going to do about this, folks? How are we going to protect our phony baloney jobs? And what are we going to do about this? And so we designed a wonderful reporting system. Well, we thought it was wonderful, where everybody who was responsible for a potable water system in the province would need to do an analysis of it and report annually on how they were doing. right? And in our policy analysis minds, we were thinking, okay, well, if we have everybody take a critical look at how they're dealing with these systems and then they report to us, we'll be in better shape to be able to try and be proactive about any actions that might need to be taken. And sometimes just by sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sometimes just by forcing organizations and municipalities to look at their operations, we're gonna see benefits, because things will be self-evident just from having looked at them. What we forgot, and that's why I say this is one of my best failure of implementation stories. We never talked about who in the ministry was going to be dealing with those reports. So for the first 2 or 3, and Shelley, don't tell anybody I ever said this in public, if for the first 2 or 3 years that we had communities report on how their water systems are doing, we didn't have anybody look at the report. We'd never talked to the people in advisory services or in policy branch that we're going to have to actually be the ones where, in a perfect world, where they would be the ones poring over these reports and saying, okay, Ogama's got this, and, Kindersley's got that, and we got to make sure we got to phone them and all that. We didn't have anybody. So we, despite our good intentions, we totally fell off on the implementation because we hadn't talked to the people that were actually going to be doing it. And we'd never even asked them if they thought it was a good idea. So that was a horrible mistake in judgment on my part, frankly, even though there were others that shared that. So here's some, again, just a list, key components. Use it for the purposes of good. Use it as your own mental checklist. Before you start really talking about implementation, run your finger down that and say, okay, have we defined our problem? Have we coordinated all of our activities and had some comprehensive engagement? Have we identified our resources with clearly defined roles and responsibilities? All of those things that will help to dispel or to avoid the problems that Shelley just mentioned about problems from the implementation perspective. Here's 4 easy groupings for you. Okay, so when your implementation strategy, you can have as many components as you want, but here's 4 really common ones, and I would suggest you maybe build on that after for your own purposes. But you need a communication strategy. Maybe you need a change management strategy. How are we going to get folks to believe that this is the right thing to do and then support them while they learn how to do it? What's our risk management strategy, and how are we going to manage performance? The managing the performance strategy is one of the ones that is often given the least amount of thought, but it can be the most important one. It relates back to this notion, as I said earlier, of aim small, miss small, and of making small course corrections as you're implementing things. But these are 4 good categories for you to use and again, it need not be more complicated than you need it to be, but here's some 4 for you. Engagement is also an important part of implementation. So you engaged while you were developing the policy. You're going to engage again when you're implementing. And again, these next few slides are just, I'm conscious of the time here, Megan, so I'm whipping through these pretty fast. But if you're looking for a bit of a checklist or a bit of a touchstone for yourselves, about have we engaged, and who do we need to be talking with? Here's some thoughts for you. Again, this is a great quote. I love it. Please feel free to steal it. George Bernard Shaw said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Right? Every staff satisfaction or user satisfaction survey that I've ever been involved in, people will always say, you don't communicate with us enough. We don't know enough about what's going on in your organization. So I immediately go, okay, well, how can we solve that problem? Should I write to you more often? Oh God, no. Don't. The last thing we need is more emails. How about briefing notes? Should I provide you with a set of briefing notes every week on? No, we have too much to read already. How about regular meetings? Should we get together, say every two? No, we got too many meetings. Everybody wants to be communicated with, but nobody wants more communication. So you need to think about that push-pull in this process when you're designing using lots of channels. Is one way of getting around it. People are learning different ways, right? Some people are visual learners, some people are oral learners, some people just need to get hit over the head enough times until it sinks in. Listening is important, and then keeping it simple. That used to say KISS, KISS, the keep it simple, Sally, or keep it simple, stupid, that you used to be able to say in the old days. Then I had some new Canadians came back to me and they had absolutely no idea what that acronym was. So I changed it to keep it simple. Again, trying to be responsive. Shelley spoke of this, or she didn't call it this, but she did talk about it, or she was kind of getting at it. Peter Drucker, our guru, I don't know when that picture's from, but it's an old one. Anyway, Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And there are going to be opportunities for you to take a serious look at how the culture of your organization will impact your implementation efforts and compromise your results. There are 3 reasons why people resist change. One of them is they don't like change. Second one is that they don't like the change you're proposing. And the third one, particularly if you're in a management role, is they don't like you. And so you need to figure out a way of getting around those 3 sorts of implementation challenges. And here's, again, just some food for thought for you to think about. Why do people resist change in the first place? You know, you're going to have, anytime you do a policy change, you're going to have between 50 and 60% of the people that are impacted by it say, you know, they'll believe it on faith. Yeah, you know what, that sounds good. What we were doing hasn't been working that great. Let's try something new. And you're going to have about 30% of your impacted stakeholder population, decision makers, whatever, that are going to question it. They're going to need some convincing. They're going to be from Idaho or Iowa on some of these things, and they're going to say, you know, prove it to me. You're going to have 10 to 15%. It won't matter what you do. They're not going to like it. So you need to reconcile in your own mind about what level of acceptance is going to be necessary for you to drive this change home and to make it work, and then what you have to do from a communications perspective to get to it. Here's just a list of the things why people worry about it. And if you can answer these questions, you're going to be in much better shape to head off any sort of resistance. Here's just another kind of a laundry list to guide some of your communication efforts. If you're going to, when you're going to design your engagement and when you're going to talk to folks about what the plan is. What's the change? When is it doing it? Why are we doing it? How are they going to be affected? Do they have to park in a different place? Are they going to move to a different desk? Does this mean that they get, you know, is their coffee break going to be impacted? All of these things come into the resistance side of culture change, and the better off you can be, then the more prepared you are, the better off you're going to be. And Megan has dropped a little note in the chat. We've got a couple minutes left. I'm nearing the end of this, but I want to leave some time for questions, and I can stay as long as you want me to. So if you folks have other stuff to do, that's cool. But I'll whip through these last few slides, and then we'll see if there's anything we want to discuss. Before you're implementing, make sure that you've identified roles and allocate resources. We've all been in a situation where something is being done and you're trying to do it off the side of your desk. Try to avoid that if you can. I know it's not always possible, but really by identifying out roles and resources at the front end, you establish some clear accountability and some clear it's your responsibility to get this done. Develop an actionable plan and report on it. Sometimes, if it's something simple, it's going to be pretty easy to do, but sometimes it's a multi-year phase and you're going to have to report over times. And then how will you communicate and celebrate success? One of the things that we most often forget to do is to pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, you know what? We did a really good job on that. Now to Shannon and others' points about review and evaluation and making course corrections and making measures meaningful. One of the things that Drucker said as well was that you can't manage what you don't measure. So anytime you're implementing a policy, it's really important that you spend some time defining where you're at. Where are we at right now? Because in order to measure change, you have to compare the two, right? You have to, where were we? We did these things and now we're in a new place. Did it work out the way you wanted it to, or did we miss the mark? It also helps at this stage to define your measures, your success, your indicators of success, because it helps you know what you're going to count or measure or keep track of as you're implementing. Lots of times in the ministry, we get to the end of something, say, well, that went pretty good. Let's have a debrief. And we'd say, well, how many calls did we get on this? Oh, I don't know. I never tracked them. I had like 7. And how many did you have, Paul? You had 8. Okay, so we had 15. Anybody else have any? And nobody could remember, right? So all of this notion of having track of your outcomes, and it also helps you to devise good ways of measuring and counting as you're implementing, so that you can have something to evaluate at the end of it. Again, without belaboring it, you're talking about efficiency and effectiveness and customer satisfaction, and whatever other rubrics or what other indicators of success that you've decided on as a part of your planning process, and you'll want to be able to address them in some level of detail, because that's where you're going to then go back and say, start the policy cycle again, right? We tried something, it worked pretty good. We think we can do better. All right. So then you jump through those processes again, and you refine your actions so that at the end of the day, you've got something that everybody can live with and that is actually going to be effective. So that probably just made everybody go, oh my God, what did I sign up for? Because it was so fast. But what I wanted to give you was a bit of a snapshot into the things that we talked about, what policy is like these days, and some of the new ways of thinking about this stuff. And just in our last couple of minutes, if people can hang on, I'd be happy to, I'd really be interested in your comments and advice and observations. But if anybody has any questions, we're happy to hear them as well. And maybe any comments that you might have had on the pre-workshop materials. Did you have a chance to go through those, and did you find them useful?
Workshop's awesome, fast and furious, but it was great. And the pre-workshop material was really helpful because I read it and now I'm hearing it. So it's taking me, back to what you'd already sent. So yeah, I really appreciate you doing this. It's been good for my brain to like reconsider this stuff.
Good. But as somebody that we haven't heard from, Kennedy or Andrew or Tim, any thoughts and observations on what you've heard or the pre-workshop materials, or does any of this hold water in your experience?
I also agree with the pre-workshop materials being helpful. Then it allowed us to go quicker because you kind of already have an idea of what is going on.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is Tim here. Yeah, very thorough, Keith. Fast and furious is probably a good way to describe it. And I enjoyed it. It was good. I appreciate having the materials in advance as well. Those were very useful and helpful.
Okay, does anybody need to have ordinarily the access to those pre-workshop materials that would be done today after we're done? But if you've all been in and you've all printed off anything that you want, and you've saved those PDFs and any of the other little takeaways, then that's fine. But if anybody needs a little bit more time to do that, just let me know, and I'll have the office extend your the ability for you to be able to get into that section on the RISE program for as long as you need. So let me know if that's a concern for anybody.
Yeah, can we have it open for at least like a day? I haven't been at the office to print anything yet.
Okay, what I'll do is I'll as soon as we're done here, I'll let the staff know that we want to leave it open till the weekend. We'll leave it open till Friday, and that will give you the end of the week to do whatever you want. I would ask you to please, because these are all copyrighted materials and ones that me and my colleagues have sweated over, don't share them with anybody that isn't in our family. But do feel free to use them for whatever other purposes you might have. And if you want to steal some of them, and that's okay too, because I do that all the time.
I actually really like the pre-workshop materials because what I do is I go over them, and then we have the workshop, and then I'll go over them after as well to glean additional information. So I appreciate that, Kate. Yeah,
one of the things that we were short on, and I just want to make sure Tim gets this, because we're talking about doing something like this at the SPRA, the training extravaganza week that they do in Humboldt every year. I'm about doing more of a half day on this, and what you missed in terms of this being a half-day session would be primarily the small group where we would challenge you to go back and talk with a group of your peers about how you've dealt with some of these things. We didn't have time to do that today, but we do really try to build in some time for reflection and time for that group synthesis to happen in most of ours, but we only had 90 minutes today. So anyway, any final thoughts, questions, or observations from anybody? All right. Thank you for your time and your attention. It's been my pleasure. I'll turn it back to you, Megan. I'll stop sharing and we can look at each other for a minute.
So, and I really just wanted to say thank you so much. I hope I got kicked out about halfway through. So thank you so much for everything. So thanks, Kate, for this amazing workshop. There's a lot that I learned. I did take notes. There's no good way to implement a bad policy. I like that. Yes, we can do it, but we need to ask ourselves if there were the right people to do it. These are just some of the things that I took. Ask good questions Implementation has 4 good categories of strategies. So communications, risk management, change management, performance management. Everybody wants to be communicated with, but nobody wants more communication. I know we refer to that quite a bit as engagement burnout. There's a lot of engagement that's been taking place and we start to get burned out. You can't manage what you don't measure. And the last thing that I learned was Keith ate the lead paint off of his crib. So
Maybe explains a lot, eh? Never wore a helmet when I rode my bike either.
I heard that one too. I didn't either though. You're going to get 2 evaluations, I imagine, one from JSGS and one from myself with SARP. We would really appreciate any feedback that you have for us on this this opportunity. All feedback is welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure. So don't forget, thank you so much, Keith, for taking the time and giving us this wonderful version, because if anybody does take part in the SPRA one, they're going to know it even more and you can answer all the questions. You can be the expert in the room.
And they're going to ace this one. But then if we do anybody that's seen this before, then we're going to make them in charge of a group. So
Yep. Yeah.
Anyway, all right, great to see all those of you who I know. Good to see you. Nice to meet you, Kennedy, and good to see everybody. Take care and stay warm, and go Team Sask, all of them.
Thank you all.
Okay, take care, everyone.
For some reason, just one moment. Stop recording. Oh, it won't let me stop recording, Guy. Probably because I'm on a different computer.